Hey, folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. In this video, I want to do a review with you out of chapter 20. This is the resistance training concepts chapter on acute variables of training. Now, there's quite a few of them, and this will be the first, probably of two, maybe three videos where I kind of just review it with you to help you understand exactly what the acute variables are, and for the most part, how they're used, because it is really important that you understand each of these concepts. NASM, and again, this is so if you got your textbook, out of chapter 20, I'm on page 618. This is just a subheading, acute variables of training, and I'll go through a couple of pages. It falls under the introduction to acute variables, which starts on page 617. Now, look, as always, my recommendation is that when you start the study of any of these chapters, all 23 of these chapters, you begin at the very back of the chapter first. Read the chapter summary, and then the highlights for sure, because it's the highlights that are in a bullet point format that really give you an initial beginning phase of study. That's very, very helpful. Again, NASM, in my opinion, in their seventh edition, sixth edition as well, but really well in the seventh edition, put their textbook together to be very academic friendly when it comes to studying their materials. So again, I just recommend go to the back, do the chapter highlights. I've done videos on exactly how to do this, and you can check them out as well. But you go through that, and as you'd be going through the chapter, obviously the charts, tables, the side panel definitions, and then you can get a little bit more in depth depending on how much time you have to study. So the acute variables of training then are really, really important. So uh, one important thing to keep in mind, NASM tends to repeat a lot throughout the textbook. So this is not, chapter 20 is not the first place nor the last place you're going to see the concept of acute variables of training. The first place you're going to see it, I think it's the first, at least it's one place, is on chapter 13, page 423. They've got literally one paragraph that says acute variables of training, and they've got a definition. So it's not this, and that's not a bad thing, by the way. Having repetition of materials hit you like this throughout a textbook can be very helpful from a memorization perspective. And then I have a stretch your knowledge box. And so it's just kind of getting you prepared, but they really hit on the importance and what they actually are on that page or chapter 20, page 618, acute variables of training. And again, you will see how they're actually used. And this is a really important area to memorize is also once you get to the actual training or program optimum performance training model where they give you, and now I literally have to turn my textbook like this because they give you tables, and in other videos, like I say, I've already explained that it's really important that you memorize certain parts of the tables. But for instance, on page 699, you have the table 21.9, for instance, phase one stabilization endurance training. And this is an entire table, but at the very top are your acute training variables. So your sets, reps, tempo, rest, intensity, exercise selection, things like that. So, all right. So that's the intro back to the acute variables of training themselves. Like I say, I'm only going to get through a couple here before I end this video, and you'll see continuations on the next at least one, perhaps two more videos. Acute variables of training, just by definition, acute variables are the most fun, and I'm on page 618 right now. The most fundamental components of designing a training program. So these are the variables that are used. You put them together, and that's the application part of an actual resistance training program, including resistance exercise. They determine the specific demands placed on the body over the course of exercise training. Look, you all know, for the most part, if you've been working out for more than 3 weeks, you already know what these variables are. They are your repetitions, the sets, the training intensity, how hard you're going to train, whatever that means, repetition tempo or the speed at which you perform the exercises, i.e., how slow you perform the negative part of a movement, if you're pausing in the stretch, isometric, how long it takes you to perform the positive or the concentric, and if you're going to pause, for instance, in the peak contraction part of the that isometric contraction as well. There are rest intervals, the training volume, right, which is just the reps times sets times the number of exercises, training frequency, training durations, exercise selection, exercise order. Now, again, like I say, you already know these. Maybe you only really concentrate on the first two repetitions and sets, but all the other ones are critically important when it comes to accomplishing whatever the goal is that your clients have with resistance training. So when applied, I'm just reading the paragraph, when applied during an exercise program, the acute variables dictate these demands and the adaptations achieved. What does that mean? That means your body will adapt to the variable of reps, for instance. So if you're doing 5 reps consistently over time with a certain load versus 20 reps over time with a specific load, those those variables, the way you are affecting and utilizing that one variable called the repetition or the range of repetitions, that's going to dictate to a great extent the adaptation that the muscle goes through. That's why acute variables are so important. Properly manipulating these acute variables fosters structured and systematic program planning to elicit optimal performance. Yes, of course, obviously. If I do a certain type of training routine with specificity to my acute variables, i.e., 5 repetitions for 5 reps versus 20 repetitions for 2 reps, I am going to create an adaptive environment based on how those acute variables are being managed, and I will get a certain outcome. They're going to be different probably if I did with those 2 examples. And that's really all that's telling you. So, to ensure proper development and progression of a resistance training program, just so you know, the average client that you deal with, you can do a lot of different variations to the acute variables. In fact, way back when I used to train a lot of clients, for the most part, my goal was to mix it up as much as I could. You're doing higher repetitions. Now, I never went lower, depending on the client, of course, but I seldom ever went really low. I would very seldom ever do less than 8 to 10 reps, just as a for instance, simply because the load imposed on the particular exercise or muscle that I was working uh, could be too high at those lower repetition ranges. But understand this is the adaptive nature and the effective use of these acute variables. So, development progression of a resistance training for fitness professionals must understand the acute training variables, right? Just repeating what we've already spoken about. Each of the acute variables are thoroughly explained. Well, not thoroughly, but they're explained, and they're explained well enough. Trust me. So I'm just going to go over the first couple here in this video, just to kind of give you if it's a review, it's a review. If it's an overview, then it's an overview for you. If it's something new, then that's great as well. So the first one we look at is what's known as a repetition. It refers to the number of times an exercise is completed. For example, performing 15 reps of a bicep curl involves curling the weight upward for a total of 15 times. Okay, now stop. The better way to understand, and actually will makes more sense with repetition tempo, but I might as well say it up here in repetitions. A repetition is a completed movement pattern which involves the 3 types of contractions that skeletal muscles, can go through: concentric or positive, or the positive, eccentric contractions, or what we call the negative when the muscle lengthens under tension, and then isometric contractions. So technically, a repetition is that full movement pattern where you start in a position and you complete the eccentric, isometric, concentric, or you can start in a reverse position and the first part of the movement is the concentric and the eccentric. They're using a bicep curl. I'll give you a great example of how to understand this. Technically, if I wanted to, I could start a bicep curl with the dumbbells up at the top position, couldn't I? Right? The bicep curl police aren't going to get you if you start your dumbbell curls up here. Most of us start them at the bottom position, but I can do whatever I want to do. I can start my curls up here. You got it? So a complete repetition would be when I do a range of motion that allows me to do both the concentric and eccentric contraction, isometric contraction at the bottom, for instance, and then end at this top position. Or I can start my bicep repetition in the bottom where now I'm going to initiate with a concentric, then the eccentric, and then that would be the completion of one repetition. So again, the repetition by strict definition is irrespective of where the starting point is for the exercise, it's going to be a complete cycle so that wherever you start, you end back. If I start at the top, a repetition is going down to the bottom and then back up to the top. That's one repetition. If I start at the bottom and I come up and I go down, that is one repetition. Think about that for any exercise now that you perform. Now, this is really weird, but I guess if you started a squat in the bottom position, I guess you could start, you grab the weight off the rack and get to the bottom and hold it. Going up and down would be one repetition versus what we normally do, which is we take the bar off the rack and we start at the top. We go down and then we go back up. That's a single repetition. So again, technically the definition, strict definition of the rep would be the cyclical completion, where you have performed both a concentric and eccentric and probably have paused and hit an isometric contraction where that changeover occurs. So at the end of my concentric, pause isometric, whoosh, and then you're doing your eccentric or concentric, whichever one it is. So again, strictly, it doesn't matter where the load or the piece of equipment starts, as long as you get back to that starting position. Technically, that is one repetition. Now, there is another sort of component to this, which I was always a stickler on, but I guess nowadays it's not that big of a deal. But the other component to the repetition is that there's no rest. There's no rest from one repetition to the next. And now let me just help you to understand this. If I start a dumbbell curl in the bottom position and I keep my elbow slightly bent, there's some tension on my bicep. If I take the dumbbell and curl it up, keep tension on the muscle, and then come back down into a position where I maintain tension, that's one repetition, I can now continue the count, one and then into two repetitions. However, technically, if I were to relax the muscle at any point in the exercise, technically that repetition is completed. Hope that makes sense. In other words, you can do one repetition of a curl, come down, but if you relax, that's it. That's one repetition. This makes more sense, obviously, when we get to the concept of a set. Okay, so you got repetitions, and then you have what's known as a set. It describes a group or a continuous movement of repetitions without any rest in between that are performed consecutively. So the quantities of the other acute variables, in other words, reps, training intensity, as well as the fitness level of the client, determine the number of sets that an individual will perform. This is really important, though, what they say here. There is an inverse relationship between sets, reps, and intensity. The individual usually performs fewer sets when performing higher reps at a lower intensity, right? Lighter weight. Well, by default, the weights are going to be lighter than if you're doing fewer repetitions and more sets when performing lower repetitions at a higher intensity. Now, I will say this, by default, if I'm going to choose a lower rep range, you get it? If I choose to use a lower rep range, by default, the general consensus is that I will be using heavier loads. The understanding is that I am going to attempt to do a certain number of repetitions that will cause me to fatigue, pretty close to fatigue at the very end of that last part of the repetition range. If I choose 8 reps, for whatever reason, not interested in the reason right now, but if I choose an 8 repetition range set, technically I should be hitting fatigue, and therefore there's a certain load I need to hit fatigue at 8 reps. I hope that makes sense. In other words, if I'm doing dumbbell curls and I'm holding a 5 pound dumbbell, I don't do 8 reps. 8 reps with 5 pounds doesn't make any sense. I'm not even warming up at 8 reps. I need a significant higher load to get to the point where, because I chose 8 reps, when I get to 6 reps, it's getting harder. 7, I might even hit total fatigue at that point for that particular load and rep range. So I get to 8, and that's about it. Boom, that's it. There's a load that coincides with that ability to perform 8 repetitions to that point of fatigue. And so it's not really even necessary to talk about intensity. Again, by default, the intensity is going to be significantly higher with a lower rep range than with a higher rep range, right? Because I'm going to be using, by default, more resistance to only perform 8 versus being able to perform 15 or 20 reps. So you got your reps and your sets, and therefore what NASM is saying, and of course this is convention by convention, that we normally will say if you're doing more repetitions, you're doing fewer sets in general. If I'm doing fewer repetitions, I'm doing more sets. And really, the reason that you're doing this sort of indirect, or excuse me, this inverse relationship is because of what's known as training volume, which they'll get to later on. But again, if you're doing lower repetitions and you need to get a certain amount of volume of training into your workout, by default, you must do more sets of those fewer repetitions to ensure that you're getting enough training volume to establish enough um, fatigue level training to the significant number of muscle fibers. That's the way it works. So you got reps, you got sets, then there's training intensity, and I'll end this video with training intensity. Um, Generally, we use training intensity and resistance training to speak to the total load that's being used. Now, before I even get into this, understand something. We tend to have multiple sort of definitions of intensity. See, if I'm on the push down machine and I'm doing triceps, I train really intense when I'm sitting there on my last reps and I'm going and I'm doing negatives and I'm getting, well, man, he trains super intense. And then you go over and you look at the weight stack and it's 30 pounds. That's not really intense. I might look intense, but that's not intensity. So intensity, again, from a scientific or from a training science perspective, we have to have a way of measuring objectively this variable, not subjectively because you're sweating and you're breathing hard and you're crushing it at the very end. No, not that's not really. You may train quote, and you got to put it in air quotes. Oh, intense, but that's not the way we understand it in exercise science. The way we understand it in the science of exercise is we understand that the load is going to determine intensity. So technically, the heavier the weight for the same exercise for the same person is higher intensity than a lower load or a lighter weight in the same exercise for the same individual. Okay. You understand why I'm saying that for the same individual is because person A and person B can be very different in their overall strength capacity. Somebody can bench press 300 pounds like it's nothing. And then another person can only bench 100 pounds, but can only do it for 5 repetitions. Who is training at a higher level of intensity? Well, if we say weight is the determining factor, then the 300 pounds, yeah, but he's doing 300 pounds for 5 reps like it's nothing. Bang, 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 bang. He puts it back. Was that high intensity? The answer is no, which is why we've got to make that when we talk about intensity, it has to be specific to the particular individual. 100 pounds for 5 reps versus 50 pounds for 5, 10, 12, 15 reps. The 100 pounds for that individual is higher intensity. So it always makes sense to make sure we understand it from that perspective. We're talking about it based on the actual individual. Um, and they even, by the way, they even say that although intensity can be described as simply the degree of effort, which is what I was, getting crazy about when I first started this conversation on training intensity. Um, it is commonly expressed as a percentage of one repetition max and equates to the number of reps that can be performed with a given weight. Now, speaking of 1 RM or one repetition max, in the field or the world of personal fitness training where we are dealing with the average client, detrained clients, that doesn't exist. We don't do it. In fact, we don't recommend doing anything less than 6 to 8 repetitions for the average client. Now, 1 RM can be used for athletes and is used to determine training loads that we're going to be using during whatever part of the periodization schedule you're in, kind of the off season, wherever you're at. For athletes, where I'm not worried about them hurting themselves, so to speak, we do 1 RMs, and yet we only do it for 2, maybe 3 exercises. I don't do deadlifts. I don't do deadlifts with anybody unless you're a power lifter. The other two are basically the bench press and the squat. So understanding intensity based on one rep max or the 1 RM is a great way, but it's so few people that you're ever going to do it with. It's just easier to understand your training intensity as the respective load or weight that an individual can use, and then you're gauging the amount of load that's used based on their strength and their increase in strength and power. And so their training intensity is higher or lower based on that individual's ability to use a particular load for a particular exercise. Again, we don't do 1 RMs for dumbbell curls. Why would we do that? That makes no sense. We don't do 1 RMs for lateral raises. I mean, number one, you couldn't even um, look at the percent of 10-pound dumbbell. What are you going to do? 7.3 pounds at 75? Doesn't make any sense. So we don't generally look at 1 RMs at all for the average client. Very, very few individuals. These would generally be athletes there where we're working a little bit more diligently to establish more precise training loads. So the average client, we don't. Okay. So that's training intensity. A client's physical capabilities, fitness level, nutritional status, and goals determine the the quantity of repetitions, sets, training intensity, and they're sending you over to table 20.3, which is on the next page, and then you've got your suggested acute variables, and that takes care of those 3. So I hope this is helpful. The next video, of course, will begin. We'll talk about repetition, tempo, and then move further through. Remember, the acute variables of training are very important for 2 reasons. This is real world. This is the real world of resistance training for the average client. When you are doing uh, fitness training, resistance, any type of external load training for your clients, these are critical. So that's number one. Number two is you're going to get lots of questions on this on the NASM exam, which is what we want you to pass as well. So I'm hoping this was helpful. If so, please write the word understand. Let us know if we can be of assistance. Remember, if you have not done so, please make sure that you subscribe to our channel. Give us a thumbs up if you liked the video, and for sure, there's no reason why you wouldn't. But go ahead and share it with folks that you know. We are here to help you to pass the NASM exam. Okay, and if you've got questions on it, you let us know in the comments section below. Have a great week. We'll see you next week. Bye.